Today, we're diving deep into the laws of human nature by Robert Greene, a book that spends over 500 pages doing something most of us spend our entire lives avoiding, looking honestly at the parts of human behavior we'd rather not admit exist, especially in ourselves. Here's the problem this book solves. We move through the world constantly surprised by people. A trusted colleague suddenly turns on us. A calm, reasonable friend explodes over something small. We fall for a charming partner who turns out to be someone entirely different once the relationship deepens. And after each of these surprises, we tell ourselves the same comforting story. That person was simply irrational, or toxic, or not who we thought they were. Greene's argument, built from years of studying psychology, history, and the private letters and biographies of historical figures ranging from Napoleon to Queen Elizabeth I, is that these surprises are rarely as unpredictable as they feel. There are patterns underneath human behavior, consistent, describable patterns that most of us never learn to read, because we're taught to think of people as fundamentally rational, when in fact, underneath the surface, almost none of us are. Greene calls these patterns laws. 18 of them in total, each one describing a force operating in human nature so consistently that once you learn to see it, you start noticing it everywhere, in coworkers, in family members, in political leaders, and most uncomfortably, in the mirror. He's careful to frame the book not as a manual for manipulating other people, but as a form of practical wisdom, the ability to see clearly, to protect yourself from people operating according to darker versions of these laws, and to master your own less flattering instincts before they quietly sabotage a career, a relationship, or a reputation you spent years building. Greene arrived at this project after already spending years studying power and strategy, and he noticed something that troubled him about that earlier work. Understanding strategy and power meant nothing if you couldn't first understand the raw material those strategies operate on, the actual, often irrational psychology of the people involved. So he spent years cross-referencing findings from psychology and neuroscience against the historical record, reading private letters, court records, and biographies of figures across centuries and cultures, looking for patterns of human behavior consistent enough to call laws rather than mere tendencies. What emerged wasn't a tidy, comfortable picture of humanity. It was something closer to a field guide, unflinching about the darker undercurrents running beneath nearly all of our polished, socially acceptable behavior. What makes the book genuinely useful rather than simply cynical is Greene's insistence that every single law cuts both ways. Each chapter closes not with a warning to fear human nature, but with a practical method for working with it, transmuting the darker version of each pattern into something he calls its higher form. Irrationality managed into rational awareness, narcissism managed into genuine empathy, aggression managed into productive assertiveness. The book isn't arguing that people are fundamentally bad. It's arguing that these forces exist in everyone, and that pretending otherwise is precisely what leaves us blindsided by them, in others and in ourselves. Over the next half hour, we're going to walk through several of the most powerful laws in the book, why we're all far less rational than we believe, why almost everyone you meet is secretly performing a version of themselves, and why the very traits we're proudest of often carry the seeds of our own undoing. Before we get into it, if you're someone who genuinely loves books like this, ideas that don't just entertain you but actually change how clearly you see the people around you and yourself, it would mean a lot if you hit subscribe, tap that like button, and turned on notifications. This channel exists for people who want to think more clearly and live more intentionally, and there's a lot more of that coming. All right, let's get into it. The law of irrationality and the law of narcissism. Let's start with the law Greene places first, because in many ways it's the foundation everything else in the book rests on, The law of irrationality. Our culture likes to imagine the human mind as a rational actor, weighing evidence and making sound decisions, with emotion as an occasional interference. Greene flips this entirely. He argues emotion isn't an occasional interruption to rational thought, it's the default operating system, and rational thought is the fragile, occasional exception. Every decision you make starts with an emotional reaction, and what most of us call reasoning is often just the mind constructing a plausible justification for a conclusion the emotions already reached moments earlier. He illustrates this with what he calls the fallacy of understanding others, the almost universal assumption that we correctly judge the people around us based on how they present themselves, their words, their surface behavior, their reputation. In reality, Greene argues, we rarely study people's actual patterns of behavior closely enough to see who they really are. We form impressions quickly, based on charm, confidence, or a story someone tells about themselves, and then we spend enormous energy defending that initial impression against new evidence, rather than genuinely updating it. The remedy isn't becoming coldly logical, which Greene considers impossible and even undesirable. It's developing what he calls rational awareness, the discipline of noticing your own emotional reactions as they happen, pausing before acting on them, and specifically watching for moments of unusually strong emotion, since those are precisely the moments irrationality tends to seize the wheel most completely. From there, Greene moves into a law that tends to make people uncomfortable the moment they hear its name, the law of narcissism. He's careful to draw a crucial distinction here between healthy narcissism, a basic, functional sense of self-worth everyone needs to operate in the world, and toxic narcissism, a deep, unmet hunger for validation rooted in childhood experiences of not being adequately seen or mirrored by a caregiver. Healthy narcissists, having received that early sense of being valued, develop what Greene calls empathy, the genuine capacity to imagine another person's internal experience. Toxic narcissists never fully develop that capacity, and instead spend their entire lives seeking external validation to fill a hole that validation alone can never actually fill. Greene makes a claim that reframes how you might see almost everyone you interact with, that we are all, to varying degrees, somewhere on a narcissistic spectrum, and that recognizing where someone sits on it is one of the single most useful skills in reading human character. Deep narcissists are recognizable by patterns Greene lays out precisely: an inability to handle criticism without disproportionate anger, a tendency to talk endlessly about themselves while showing little curiosity about others, and relationships that reliably follow the same arc, an intense, charming beginning followed by conflict once the other person fails to provide the constant admiration the narcissist secretly requires. The practical value of this law isn't diagnosing people from a distance for sport. It's protecting yourself from investing deeply in relationships with people who are structurally incapable of genuinely seeing you, and, just as importantly, developing what Greene calls the empathetic gaze in yourself, actively practicing the effort to see other people's internal world instead of only your own. He offers a concrete exercise for building this capacity deliberately, imagining, in real detail, the specific childhood or circumstances that might have shaped a difficult person's current behavior, not to excuse harmful conduct, but to interrupt the automatic tendency to see other people only through the narrow lens of how their behavior affects you. This small repeated act of imaginative effort, Greene argues, is precisely the muscle toxic narcissists never developed, and precisely the muscle worth strengthening deliberately in yourself, since it tends to improve nearly every relationship it's applied to, not just the difficult ones. Greene illustrates the narcissistic spectrum with historical figures who sat at its most extreme end, Leaders whose early charm and confidence won intense loyalty, only for that same magnetic self-assurance to curdle, over years in power, into an inability to tolerate any dissent or bad news at all. Advisors around such figures often learn quickly that delivering unwelcome truths carried real professional risk, which meant the leader became increasingly insulated from the very information that might have corrected a disastrous course, surrounded instead by people whose survival depended on telling them exactly what they wanted to hear. Greene's point in returning to these historical cases isn't simply cautionary storytelling. It's demonstrating how consistently this exact pattern, initial charisma curdling into a hunger for constant affirmation, echoes across entirely different eras, cultures, and fields, suggesting something structural about the psychology involved, rather than a set of unrelated personal failings. The law of role-playing and the law of covetousness. Greene's next law tends to land as a genuine surprise because it names something we all do constantly without ever quite admitting it: the law of role-playing. Nearly everyone you meet, in nearly every interaction, is performing some version of a mask, a socially acceptable presentation designed to hide less flattering motives, insecurities, or intentions. This isn't necessarily deceptive in a sinister sense. Greene argues masking is simply a requirement of functioning in society. We can't walk around broadcasting every irritation, every insecurity, every selfish impulse, and expect relationships to survive it. The problem isn't that people wear masks. It's that most of us never learn to read past them, taking the polished surface at face value, instead of watching for the details that leak through. He teaches a specific discipline for this, learning to read what he calls the telltale signs, the small, often involuntary details that betray what a carefully maintained mask is trying to conceal. Words are the easiest thing to control, and therefore the least reliable indicator of what someone actually feels. Tone of voice, timing, and especially body language are far harder to consciously manage and tend to leak the truth, even when the words themselves are saying something else entirely. A compliment delivered with a slightly clipped tone, a slight delay before an enthusiastic yes, a genuine smile that fails to reach the eyes. These micro-signals, Greene argues, are far more diagnostic of someone's real feelings than anything they'll actually tell you outright. He encourages training yourself to notice patterns over time rather than single incidents, since one instance could be a fluke, but a repeated pattern reveals character reliably, almost regardless of what someone claims about themselves. From reading others, Greene turns to a force he considers one of the most powerful and least examined drivers of human behavior: the law of covetousness, essentially, desire itself, and specifically what makes desire spike or vanish. He observes something almost paradoxical about human wanting, that it's rarely triggered by an object's actual intrinsic value. It's triggered by scarcity, by mystery, and by imagined unavailability. Something openly given, fully explained, and permanently accessible tends to generate remarkably little desire. Something partially withheld, slightly mysterious, or difficult to obtain becomes disproportionately attractive, almost regardless of its objective worth. Greene traces this back to early childhood, to the moment a child first realizes their parents' full attention is not automatically permanently guaranteed, and desire, in a sense, is born in that exact moment of realizing something valuable might be withdrawn. This dynamic replays constantly in adult life, in romantic relationships that cool the moment one partner becomes fully, unconditionally available, in marketing that manufactures desire through manufactured scarcity, in careers that suddenly feel more appealing the instant they seem slightly out of reach. Greene's practical insight here cuts both ways. Understanding this law protects you from being manipulated by artificial scarcity, recognizing when your own sudden intense desire for something is being manufactured rather than genuine. And it also explains why relationships and pursuits sustained entirely on unconditional availability tend to quietly lose their pull over time. A small mystery, a small space, seems to be part of what keeps genuine desire alive at all. Greene points to the French diplomat Talleyrand as a master practitioner of reading masks, a man who served through multiple, wildly different French governments by consistently reading the true intentions of powerful figures long before those intentions were ever announced publicly. Talleyrand was famous for his own carefully composed face, giving away almost nothing, while simultaneously studying every flicker of hesitation, every slightly delayed answer, in the people across the table from him. Greene uses this contrast deliberately, showing that reading others accurately and controlling your own mask are really two sides of the same discipline, and that the people history remembers as unusually perceptive were rarely relying on some mystical intuition. They were simply paying far closer attention to detail than everyone else in the room. The law of self-sabotage and the law of repression. Greene devotes a particularly striking chapter to what he calls the law of self-sabotage, built around a claim that reframes how we usually think about attitude. He argues that your fundamental outlook, whether you tend to interpret life as generally hostile and disappointing or generally full of opportunity, isn't just a personality quirk that colors how you feel. It actively shapes your reality, because attitude determines which details you notice, which risks you're willing to take, and how persistently you recover from setbacks. Two people can experience nearly identical circumstances, and the one carrying a chronically negative, defensive attitude will tend to interpret ambiguous events as further evidence the world is against them, generating a self-fulfilling spiral of caution, resentment, and missed opportunity. The one carrying what Greene calls a constructive attitude interprets those same ambiguous events far more generously and tends to notice and pursue opportunities the pessimist has already dismissed before they were fully examined. Greene ties this to research on what's sometimes called self-generated luck, the observation that people who consistently describe themselves as lucky tend to share a specific set of behaviors rather than any actual difference in the objective rate of fortunate coincidences occurring around them. They notice unexpected opportunities more readily because they're scanning for them rather than filtering them out through pessimistic assumption. They strike up conversations they didn't strictly need to have, which occasionally lead somewhere valuable. They interpret a chance encounter as potentially useful rather than irrelevant. None of this required actual luck in the supernatural sense. It required an attitude open enough to notice and act on the ordinary opportunities that a defensive, pessimistic mindset would have screened out before they even registered. He's careful to note that this isn't simply an argument for blind positivity. A constructive attitude in his framing still clearly sees obstacles and difficulty. It simply refuses to treat every setback as permanent, personal, or proof of some fixed limitation, a distinction that echoes across much of the self-help literature, but that Greene grounds specifically in how it shapes long-term life trajectory, often invisibly, over years, rather than single decisions. From attitude, Greene moves into psychologically denser territory, the law of repression, drawing directly on the idea of the shadow, the parts of ourselves, ambition, aggression, selfishness, sexuality, that we find socially unacceptable and therefore push out of conscious awareness rather than integrate. The shadow doesn't disappear simply because it's been repressed. It goes underground, and from there it tends to leak out sideways, in passive aggression, in disproportionate moral outrage at other people's flaws that happen to mirror our own disowned traits, in sudden uncharacteristic outbursts that seemed to come from nowhere but were actually building pressure for years. Greene's most useful insight here might be his explanation of why we so often become fixated, almost obsessively, on other people's specific flaws. He argues that intense moral judgment of a particular trait in someone else is frequently a signal that we're looking at a disowned piece of our own shadow, projected outward, where it's safer to criticize than to examine internally. The remedy he proposes isn't indulging every repressed impulse without restraint, which would simply create different problems. It's consciously acknowledging that these darker impulses exist in you, the way they exist in everyone, and finding safe, deliberate outlets for them, ambition channeled into achievement rather than resentment, aggression channeled into competitive drive rather than passive sabotage, rather than pretending the shadow isn't there, and letting it quietly steer your behavior from the dark. He offers a useful, slightly uncomfortable self-diagnostic here. The next time you notice yourself reacting with unusually intense moral outrage at some specific flaw in another person, greed, vanity, ambition, dishonesty, it's worth pausing to ask honestly whether that particular trait might exist somewhere in your own disowned territory, suppressed rather than absent. The intensity of the reaction, Greene suggests, is often the giveaway. A mildly annoying trait in someone else rarely provokes the kind of visceral, personal anger that a genuinely repressed shadow trait does when it's reflected back at us from the outside. The law of envy and the law of grandiosity. Greene treats envy as one of the most dangerous and most consistently denied emotions in human relationships, precisely because almost nobody willingly admits to feeling it. Unlike anger, which announces itself, envy tends to disguise itself as something more socially acceptable: harsh criticism of the envied person, sudden coolness in a friendship that used to feel warm, an unexplained urge to undermine someone's success rather than celebrate it. Greene argues that envy is specifically triggered not by people who are distant from us. A celebrity's wealth rarely stings the way it should according to pure logic, but by people close to us in circumstance, a peer, a sibling, a colleague at a similar level who suddenly pulls ahead. Proximity, not the size of the gap, is what activates envy most sharply. He offers a specific diagnostic for detecting envy directed at you, since the disguised nature of the emotion means it rarely announces itself honestly. Watch for excessive, oddly specific praise that feels slightly performative, sudden unexplained distance from someone who used to be warm, or criticism that seems disproportionate to whatever minor thing supposedly triggered it. On the other side of the equation, Greene's advice for managing your own envy is disarmingly direct. Name it honestly to yourself the moment you notice it, rather than immediately converting it into disguised criticism of the person who triggered it. Envy acknowledged consciously can be redirected into motivation. Envy denied and repressed tends to leak out sideways instead, damaging the relationship without ever addressing the actual feeling underneath it. Greene also suggests a slightly counterintuitive social strategy for diffusing envy directed at you, particularly after a visible success: openly acknowledging the role of luck, timing, or help from others in your achievement, rather than presenting it as purely the product of solitary brilliance. This isn't false modesty for its own sake. It's a practical recognition that envy is fed specifically by a sense of unbridgeable, unfair distance, and that openly including others in the story of your success tends to soften exactly the comparison that would otherwise curdle into resentment. Greene closes this stretch of the book with the law of grandiosity, a pattern he found consistently among people, often talented, sometimes brilliant, who eventually derail their own careers or relationships through an inflated, ungrounded sense of their own significance. He traces the arc carefully. It typically begins with genuine early success, talent that gets rewarded and praised. But somewhere along the way, the person begins attributing that success entirely to some innate exceptional quality in themselves, rather than to the specific effort, humility, and openness to feedback that actually produced it in the first place. Once that shift happens, grandiosity starts quietly eroding the very habits that built the success. Tolerance for criticism disappears. Curiosity about other perspectives shrinks, and an inflated self-image becomes increasingly disconnected from the reality other people are actually experiencing around them. The antidote Greene proposes is a specific ongoing discipline he calls practical grandiosity, channeling genuinely high ambition and confidence into sustained, difficult work, rather than into an inflated self-image that requires no further effort to maintain. The distinction matters enormously. Believing you're capable of something remarkable, and therefore committing to the demanding work required to actually become remarkable, is productive. Believing you already are remarkable, and therefore no longer requiring the humility, criticism, or effort that produced any real achievement in the first place, is exactly the trap that has quietly ended more promising careers than almost any external circumstance ever could. Greene returns repeatedly to Napoleon as perhaps history's clearest case study of this exact arc, a commander whose early campaign succeeded through meticulous planning, genuine attentiveness to his officers' counsel, and a realistic respect for the constraints of logistics and terrain. As his power grew, so did the myth of his own invincibility, cultivated by his own propaganda machine as much as by genuine admirers, until he found himself marching an enormous army into Russia against the advice of experienced officers who understood exactly what a Russian winter would do to overextended supply lines. The catastrophe that followed wasn't a failure of talent. Greene argues it was the entirely predictable result of a man who had stopped listening the moment his self-image outgrew the humility that built his earlier victories. The Law of Death. Greene closes the book with a law that might feel like an unusual note to end on, the law of death, but it's a deliberate choice, because he considers our relationship with mortality to be the quiet organizing force behind almost every other pattern the book describes. Most of us, he argues, live in a state of what he calls death denial, an unconscious assumption that our time is essentially unlimited, that there will always be another year to pursue the ambition we keep postponing, another decade to repair the relationship we keep neglecting. This denial isn't irrational exactly. It protects us from a genuinely difficult truth, but Greene argues it comes at an enormous, largely invisible cost, a quiet dilution of urgency that lets meaningful pursuits get crowded out by distraction indefinitely, because indefinitely never actually announces itself as a deadline. His proposed remedy is what he calls a sober awareness of death. Deliberately, regularly confronting the fact of your own limited time, not as a morbid exercise but as a clarifying one. He points to figures throughout history who used a genuine confrontation with mortality, illness, near-death experience, the death of someone close to them, as the exact catalyst that finally focused their attention on what actually mattered, cutting through years of postponement in a single sobering moment. Greene's suggestion is that you don't have to wait for a crisis to access that same clarity. Deliberately, periodically reminding yourself of your own mortality, he argues, tends to produce sharper priorities, less tolerance for wasted time on grudges or distractions, and a more urgent, honest relationship with the specific handful of things that would actually matter to you if your time were visibly running short, which of course it always has been. He points in particular to the way certain historical figures used physical proximity to mortality almost as a deliberate practice rather than an accident of circumstance. keeping a visible reminder of death close at hand, not out of morbidity, but as a disciplined counterweight against the natural human drift toward postponement. The specific method matters far less than the underlying habit, finding some regular, honest way to remember that your remaining time is not, in fact, unlimited, and letting that awareness quietly reorder what actually earns your attention today. So let's bring this all together. If there's one idea from the laws of human nature worth carrying with you long after this video ends, it's this. The people who seem to navigate life with unusual clarity, unusual composure, and unusually good judgment about others aren't operating on some mysterious instinct you weren't given. They've simply learned to see the patterns most of us walk past every day, the emotional currents beneath rational-sounding decisions, the mask beneath a polished presentation, the shadow beneath the flattering self-image in others, and more importantly, in themselves. Here's the actionable piece to walk away with today. Pick one relationship in your life right now where something has felt slightly off, a friend, a colleague, a family member, and instead of taking their words at face value this week, watch instead. Watch their tone, their timing, their body language, the pattern of their behavior over several interactions rather than one. Then turn that same lens inward honestly and ask which of these 18 laws you might be living out yourself without ever having named it. That's the whole first step. Not becoming suspicious of everyone around you, but becoming genuinely clearly awake to what's actually happening beneath the surface of your own life. If this video gave you something to sit with, I'd genuinely love to hear it. Drop a comment below with your favorite thought from today, the idea that hit you hardest, and let's talk about it. And if you want more conversations like this one, thoughtful, unhurried, built around books that actually change how you live, come join us. Subscribe to the Mind Master, and let's keep learning to see people, and ourselves, with a little more clarity than we did yesterday. I'll see you in the next one.